And thank you for the invitation, President. As the Chairman said, it is 15 years since I last had the privilege of addressing an ASTI Congress in Ennis in 1995, when invited by my former student, then ASTI President Sean Higgins. I understand that some of the comments I made on that occasion are still referred to from time to time in your conversations. This is at once flattering and disconcerting. My theme on that occasion, as some of you may recall, was the need for teachers and educationalists in general to watch their language. That is to say, to speak of teaching and education in the language appropriate to the profession, the calling, and to be alert to the danger of having what happens in the world of education colonized by concepts and a vocabulary that belong to the world of business and accountancy, or indeed of industrial production. The fact that some of my remarks of 1995 may still retain a topicality is therefore disconcerting, in that it suggests that in the intervening years, we as educationalists have not been particularly successful in resisting such colonizing of our discourse. We have not been vigilant enough in watching our language. My remarks today will not, I hope, be taken as a simple reiteration of my earlier caution, though I am unapologetic about returning to the issue of language and the discussion of education in the public sphere. But in this short prelude, about 18 to 19 minutes, if any of you are keeping an eye on your watches, in this short prelude to the President's address, I want to focus in a particular way on the role and responsibility of the teacher in rehabilitating, indeed in rescuing, the concept of trust in a society in which that word no longer retains any shared meaning or value in large areas of our public life and for large numbers of our citizens. In certain vital respects, of course, it is obvious that the situation is worse now than it was in 1995. Back then, after the harrowing 1980s, the economy was in recovery, the horizon of ambition brightening, and many influential commentators were identifying the return on the earlier state investment in education as being one of the main factors in explaining the post-1989 recovery and the rising prosperity in Ireland. Today, the economy is in crisis, and there is evidence that the social contract on which social order and cohesion in an open democratic society rests has been shaken to its foundations. We have witnessed the collapse of any credible structures or institutions of moral authority, of any reliable, widely adhered to or subscribed to frame of ethics in the assessment of social value and behaviour. Fundamentally, Irish society is currently traumatised by a crisis of trust. There are some particularly noxious symptoms of this social crisis with which you as teachers will be familiar and with which you will have to contend in the days and perhaps even in the months ahead. In the ugly mood of rage and recrimination which has been unleashed by the disclosure of the corruption of buccaneering banking and its devastating effects on the real economy and on society at large, one particularly ugly tendency is the relentless setting of private sector and public sector workers at each other's throats. In what for some parties at least is, in my view, a deliberate tactic of divide and conquer. I refer to the neoliberal backlash against the very notion of public service, the relentless caricaturing of public service employment as being parasitic, not to say vampiric, on the real wealth being generated by private enterprise in a world based on profit. This divisive note has become a striking feature of public commentary within certain arteries of public comment. And I should say it is not by any means an exclusively Irish phenomenon. Now, apart from the immediate and at a human level understandable reflex against paying taxes in a time of recession, when people are bruised and battered from loss of employment, short-term work or falls in earnings, there is a more fundamental issue at stake in our response to this oppositional version of private and public sector interests. And it is this: do we or do we not have a shared understanding of what constitutes the desired basis for social order and cohesion, for the good society? Do we understand society to be constituted as a complex set of rights, protections and entitlements on the one hand, and on the other, a set of duties, responsibilities and obligations? Or is our model that of a set of transactions in a marketplace, where the calibration of transactional cost takes precedence over the assessment of social value? These are not merely abstract concepts. We should not be scandalized, sad as it may be for us to accept it, that bruised and despairing people who have lost their jobs in the private sector, or whose children, despite formal qualifications, cannot get into the labour market, should be susceptible to an urge to see a levelling down to a common plateau of immiseration as one form of equality in the current crisis. This is what fear does to people, and we have to be understanding of it. But while there is a little of this in the recent public outpourings of rage, the more strident voices against security, decent salaries and working conditions in the public service more often belong to those who see in the current crisis an opportunity to decisively reconfigure the labour market in Ireland, private and public, aiming at the increased casualisation of labour on lower wage rates. For teachers and nurses, the offer now is an insecure contract rather than a dedicated career. The objective, the creation of a new, highly qualified spalpeen class going from place to place trying to get a contract. Now, the rhetoric driving this agenda is insidious, characterised as it is by the constant equation of security with stagnation, of rights and dignity with perks and privileges. That Ireland is a more unequal society now than it was in 1995 is supported, of course, by the evidence of all the relevant indicators. The neoliberal triumph of the Reagan-Thatcher era survived the end of their particular terms of power. Up until the current crisis, and indeed even in the throes of that crisis, the language of performance generated by the neoliberal project has pervaded all aspects of our public discourse in Ireland, including our public discussion of education.